Hello, my friends, and welcome to another fascinating episode of FISHTORY. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my all-time favorite fish in the aquarium. And if you know me in this channel, then you know that means it's going to be a nano fish and it's going to have personality. So today, we are talking about the incredible ROSY Loach. Now, you may know this fish for a while in our hobby, but it's actually brand new scientifically speaking, and there have actually been 4 different species that we've called the ROSY Loach in recent years. However, the ROSY Loach now has a new scientific name, and it goes by the species name mango. Is that not adorable? Are they not adorable? If you know this channel, you know I love tiny fish. And these fish top out at about an inch long, and they have a ton of personality. And on top of that, you get 2 species for the price of 1, in that the males and females are very different behaving and look pretty different. They're both under an inch. They have absolutely fascinating behavior when they interact with one another as a species, and then a whole different set of interactions and behaviors when they're together with other species that they naturally live with or that are similar to the ones they live with. So they're a great community fish or a great species-only tank fish. However, what's also very interesting about these fish and the ROSY Loach as a species is that it epitomizes exactly what so many species around the globe are currently going through as far as environmental challenges go, as far as challenges with pollution and agricultural runoff, as well as agricultural and industrial and urban development, with mining, with logging, and with so many other issues that are unavoidable in this day and age. So we will be talking about where they come from, which is a whole other story in itself. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode because we're going to cover a little bit about the incredible and unique ecology of Myanmar. It is a completely unique place economically, geologically, sociologically, and it has been left out of the aquarium and of largely scientific exploration for the better part of the last 75 years. So we're going to talk about some of the madness going on sociologically, economically, and culturally that has caused this, but also gives us hope for finding tons of new species in this region in the coming months and years ahead. So, we're going to talk about the state of Myanmar, how there are multiple factions running that place, and there are hill tribes that are pseudo-independent nations, as well as Chinese enclaves, as well as narco states and gem states and gold mining and all these things going on, as well as subsistence agriculture, fishing, and just about anything you can imagine under the sun, from arms trading to counterfeit cell phone markets, is going on and coming from Central Asia and China all the way through this particular very specific region where the ROSY Loach is from. As well as the ROSY Loach, you've got things like the celestial pearl danio and the emerald dwarf rasbora, and the rummy nose rasbora, lake inlay loaches, all sorts of little sundadanios, microdanios, and rasboras that we love, as well as Hillstream loaches and little tooth carps that are absolutely all the rage in the hobby as we speak. All within a place you could walk across in a day and find those species, as well as another 150 unique freshwater species within a day's walk in any direction too. So it's going to be a good episode, so strap yourself in, and if you feel so inclined, I'd love it if you hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more content like you're about to. All right, let's get into it. In a fish tank at a fish store, I saw a tank that was marked $4.99 for this new loach, and they were calling them ROSY Loaches. Now, I looked into this tank, and I saw 50 or 60 of these little fish, all an inch long, females up to an inch and a quarter, males about an inch, and that was it. Now, inside this tank, it was about a 20-gallon tank, and there were a few plants and some hardscape and these fish were behaving absolutely fascinatingly. Even though they were all kind of washed out, silvery, not that impressive looking fish, they were hopping around in mid-water like they were on pogo sticks. They were zipping around elegantly as if they could swim with no problem and didn't have to do the pogo hop. And they were holding on to all sorts of different surfaces with their ventral fins and their pectoral fins as if they were gobies. They were hanging on to pipes and onto the sponge filter and onto the glass and different hardscape. And the females had this kind of speckled black dot look to them and were mostly translucent silver or tan. And the males were mostly kind of a silvery, clear to translucent with a black line down both their sides. And they weren't very remarkable, but they were sure moving very differently between the different individuals. And the price was right. So this being about 10 years ago, I decided, let's get some. And I bought 8 of them, thinking that would give me a good number to see how they behave. Well, I ended up picking a good number because 8 is really the minimum that I would recommend getting with these creatures, as they are very social. Now, if you have less than that, it's not like they're going to be a terror or a problem. It's just you won't see that full range of behavior, and you're not going to get a chance to see them spawn, most likely. And this is one of the few loaches that is actually fairly easy to spawn and breed and keep in the aquarium hobby. In fact, in Asia, they spawn this loach rather readily, and they do that using hormones and basically causing a false signal of the breeding season. Spawning them is reliant on the monsoon season. So basically, to spawn them, it's not necessarily getting them to do any one thing or a procedure like you would with a lot of species. It's simply causing massive change in a short period of time, but not so much so that it physically harms or stresses them. So it's doing things like letting the water get warmer and warmer, all the way up to the high temperature of their range, which would be around 84 degrees Fahrenheit or 28 or so Celsius. And letting the TDS, or the hardness, the KH, the GH, the TDS, let that get up into, 200, 300 parts per million, 400 parts per million, whatever you want. It's not going to matter. As long as the pH stays between around 8 and above 6.0, they can handle it. And we'll talk about, and I'll show you, the incredible ecology that can see a fish living at 8.0 and then swinging all the way to 6.0 the other half of the year, but it has to do with that rainy season. And so, like I said, you can have the fish in warm water, in hard water, or you can put them in black water. You can put lots of botanicals and leaves and dried out seed pods and things like that in the tank. The one thing that they do actually act more lively with, and they will be more colorful, more animated with, is both live food options, very small things like Daphnia seed shrimp, and as well as a variety of algae pellets and wafers to also choose from, and actual biofilms, actual algae or cyanobacteria in small amounts are also great for them. That is what they've adapted to eat. They eat a little bit of everything, and in the wild they eat bugs, and also they can use their mouth and their onodontodes, or those cute little whiskers that both the males and females have. They can use those to feel around, even in turbid water, whether it's fast water, slow water, or it's murky or clear. They can feel around and sense for food, and what they truly love to eat is little tiny micro worms, things like vinegar eels, black worms, blood worms. They love that, but don't feed them any one massive amount of any one thing, and you'll do just fine. But to get them to spawn, they need that switch. So if they've been hanging out in black water because they're in a flooded forest type biotope, or if you've put them into a simulation of something like one of the lake reservoirs that fills up during the end of the wet season, and it becomes a massive floodplain, and then it's sitting on stone and bedrock that actually has limestone and fossils and carbonate and all sorts of other minerals in the water that causes the water to become more and more alkaline. That also is something that happens in places like Lake Inle, which is within their natural zone. And so you just need to change it. So if the monsoon season were just starting, it would be that the water would be close to neutral. So you'd want the water to be close to neutral, and you'd want to drop the temperature 5 to 6 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 or 3 degrees Celsius, give or take. And that is going to represent that massive influx of fresh water and rain that happens when it can rain up to 5 or 10 inches of water in a single 24-hour period. And evolutionarily, let me tell you about the magic that is these fish and why they have grown such a fascinating set of skills and adaptations to be quite a hardy fish. So now that you know that that's what kind of triggers them to spawn, let me tell you how they evolved in this extremely mountainous region of Myanmar. And Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is really the place where humans have treaded for tens of thousands of years. And why is that important? Well, they probably even play a role in the recent, if not the overall ecology and biology of these fish. They have lived in flooded fields and in these ditches that have been dug for rice terraces and for agriculture. And these terraces were the earlier form of growing rice, where they would plant rice and it would be dry, and they would grow it like wheat or corn or anything else, and then they would flood those fields. And it was, even though it's very labor intensive, they needed to figure out how to get water where they wanted it. And so this brought water to a lot of the valleys and evenly spread it out in ways where before it only rushed during monsoon season. So actually humans likely expanded this fish. And then not only that, before we knew of the rosy loach that we now call the mango loach, or rather the Physoshustura mango, that's its new Latin name that it got in 2023. Why did it take so long? Well, there were a bunch of other loaches from this same region, from Thailand, from the north of Myanmar, the south of China, and the far east of India, that were all kind of living in these high mountain valleys and river basins. And other than Myanmar having one massive river basin, and that being where the big cities you probably heard of, like Yangon or Mandalay, are, that river has hundreds of species of fish. Some of the biggest stingrays that there are, freshwater stingrays, some of the biggest catfish that there are. And these species and these different body styles of fish actually were tried in so many different sizes over the eons, that going all the way up into the mountains and these feeding the different creeks that feed these massive rivers right in the middle of Myanmar. The horseshoe that is kind of a stadium or amphitheater shape that is Myanmar, the center of the country is a flooded river valley that's hundreds of miles across, and swampy land and all sorts of freshwater fish, right? Well, the same little sucker fish and loaches and all these things that work in fast water, in deep water, in shallow water, in water that's full of plants, in water that's muddy, what you name it. It has been tried up in those valleys as you move north and you move up towards the Irrawaddy River Basin and you move towards the Mekong if you go even farther east. Yet mountains separate all these. So there's like a miniature version of all these different evolutionary models for fish being tried over and over. And throughout the eons, things like mudslides and rock slides happen here because of the unique makeup of the materials in the ground. The soil here, like I said, it can be KH rich, it can have carbonate, it can have the exact opposite where it has a lot of organic material and it has things like coal and actual chunks of loose graphite and carbon. It can have fossils, it can have gemstones, and it can have gold. And this leads yet again to another reason why we may not have been able to identify this fish as soon, and that is that, one, yes, a lot of these creeks have been very murky. Two, as I said, there are a lot of versions of these fish that are similar, and there were at least 4 of the same genus of this fish that may have included some things that were hybrids of this fish and another fish that's similar, that would turn a red or pink color or had some marking in combination that looked like that, even though we only have 9 fish in the genus altogether as of 2025. But the mango loach, or rosy loach as it's more popularly known, of course, It is absolutely a survivor. And this fish, when it was first being brought into the trade, was really around 10 or 15 years ago. And you're wondering to yourself, perhaps, how could a fish that is so beautiful, that behaves really interestingly, and I forgot to mention, but let me tell you now, that when they mate, the males chase the females, and you would almost assume that they're an aggressive, to the point of violence, an aggressive fish. Only a couple of the males color up, and usually one colors up an electric red and orange, and the others are somewhere in between, kind of a yellowy orange and a pink color. And this kind of shows you the built-in hierarchy within the males in the tank, and they'll have an even more bold and vivid stripe down their side of black to match the colors of orange. Some of the males may stay completely kind of drab looking and translucent, but they'll still swim around and show their stuff to the females. They'll still do interesting mating dances and things like this. And it's obvious that these fish must live in clear, shallow water, because when you dive down into the water, the light scatters, and red is the first color you start losing, along with yellow and orange after this. And so we know that these fish were in clear, shallow water, but they must have either been digging in the substrate for food or living in murky sections of water. So maybe parts of the year it was clear water during mating season, and other parts of the year it was murky, which is very, very possible when you think of the monsoon season, and how I said that these fish are found in mountain streams, and some of these mountain streams start all the way up at 2,000 meters, over 6,000 feet tall, and the tops of these mountains are almost, they're temperate. They're not tropical anymore. They can get very hot in the daytime, and they have strong winds. If you continue north another few 100 miles, and you get into the actual Himalaya mountains, the tallest mountains in the world, where you have all sorts of ice fields and glaciers and snow that actually butts up almost against a truly tropical environment if you just go a valley or two over. And so these creeks and streams may stem subtropic and into the tropic bottom of the valleys that are down at maybe 500-foot elevation or 100 meters elevation. And then the river may continue up rapids and no major waterfalls. The same water system continues up through Myanmar into the Shan state, and all the way up through different little feeder streams. And over time, these streams, like I said, mudslides and things would separate little sections of these, and like lakes would form for a number of years, thousands of years, maybe 1,000,000 years in some cases. Places like Lake Inle, where you get 58 species and 17 of them are endemic to just that lake. It's a 700,000-year-old lake that was formed when basically a mudslide or earthquake or something happened that blocked the end of the river valley, and it became a shallow, long, marshy wetland and lake, and all that diversity that was in a big old river and the feeder branches of the river then gets trapped in these side chutes. And this is what makes the ecology of Myanmar so incredible. Also, if you go farther north, you run into the Chinese border, you run into Laos, you run into Thailand, and you run into mountains that quickly go from 6,000 to 10,000, 12, 14, 15, 16,000 feet in elevation. So the water feeding into these ecosystems gets very cold. So while I said that these fish do best in the 76 to 84 range when they're in their warm season, they can actually tolerate down into the mid to low 60s, no problem in Fahrenheit. And 68 is actually considered the low end of their temperature range. Although, if you want to see them most active, keeping them around 72 degrees Fahrenheit or around, 24 Celsius, something like that, at least that much, is going to keep them much more active like they are in the spring and summer. And then after the monsoons start, they burst forth and they spawn in the shallow waters full of plants. And these waters are full of plants both domesticated like rice and soy, which are rotated in the fields and terraces. And these are the same fields and terraces that these different styles of agriculture were passed on to the people in this region. And so there's so many extra species of plants like bacopa or like Limnophilia aromatica, and these really lovely plants that are used as spices and seasoning, but they're also partially domesticated, and they've been used for over 10,000 years in this part of the world. Well, also everything culturally that wanted to make it from India, where currently we have over a billion, about 1.5 billion people in the greater India region. And then in China, we have another 1 billion to 1.5 billion people, if you count, the Koreas and Vietnam and so forth. And so you have literally almost half of the world's population. And what is the gap through the mountains? Where do all three rivers coming up into the mountains together to a low point in the mountains? It's right there at the north part of Myanmar. And that is why for thousands of years, Myanmar has been a place of instability. People have been cursed by the abundance that is there. Whether it's gold, whether it's the most dense population of rubies and sapphires in the world, there is abundance of both mineral wealth, and there are incredible fossils, incredible jade, all sorts of other gemstones. And then there's incredibly fertile land. And then all the layers of tropical forest building up over eons, and all the different life and all the water in the monsoon cycle that washes down the minerals and nutrients and life forms down from the tops of the mountains down into the valleys. And these valleys fill up with this debris over the eons, and they become just these very rich areas that then get carved up by rivers. And the people live on the water. And so above are these barren mountains when you get really high, and middle height are steep hillsides with tropical and even a mix of temperate plants that are unique. And then down low is a tropical look that looks like Bangladesh or India or other Southeast Asian, Malaysian, Singapore, Indonesian jungles and rivers. And with this, as I said, you get all that diversity, but you also get all that different plant life. And these guys eat all sorts of microcrustaceans. They live in different temperatures of water, and they live in different amounts of visibility, different amounts of oxygenation. And yes, oxygenation will keep them lively. Now, I've told you about spawning them. I've told you the best practices for keeping them and switching up their diet. Even though you can feed them things like only wafers and flake food, they do love live food, and they love hunting, and it's fascinating to watch them comb through algae and debris and find themselves a morsel to eat. But I haven't quite told you yet about, that crazy ability they have to survive the swing in those different parameters and different temperatures and food sources and things. Well, humans have added to that recently and added to the confusion. Like I said, we find hybrid versions of this genus, and we also find a lot of fish that we've never seen before. Why had you never heard of this fish? Well, this region was under colonial rule, first by Southeast Asian, Indian, and Chinese rulers for eons, then by local hill tribes. In each valley, just like there's unique species of plants and animals, there's unique tribes and unique cultures that have arisen there over the last 8 to 7,000 years. As society rose in India and China and Indonesia, it literally was a triangle surrounding, with the center being a pass that was used for trade in the Shan state. This region also became known as the Emerald Triangle later because of the illegal plants being grown and traded to the major population centers of all of Asia. And this was the main supplier before the Afghan war changed things in Afghanistan in the 21st century. But until then, most of the 20th century and late 1800s, you actually had a big source of it coming from India as well as this part of Myanmar. And this region has been very unstable. And while I said that main river valley in the center of the country was the lifeline of all the trade along the river and the easiest trade and the easiest place for people like the colonial rulers that ruled it, the British of the 1800s period, to come in and take over, after World War II, for a brief time, the Japanese came in and held it. Then the Chinese tried to hold it again. And then for a while, there was self-rule. And they wanted a mostly Buddhist and animistic, or rather, all those 150 different tribes and over 103 different languages of people and cultures and differences in each river valley, sometimes even sharing a valley or sharing a mountain ridge top. These different cultures do different things, and these different tribes have different colors and materials and technologies, but they also rose up and resisted the central government, both throughout the colonial era and then during the more modern era, where for the last 70 years, scientists and explorers and even tourists, for that matter, had been kept out of Myanmar by a group known as a military junta or junta. And this means basically a few dictators, generals in the army took over, and they changed it from a very brief republic democracy in the 50s and 60s when the British gave up their colony to it being completely a dictatorship. And you had the influence of the communists with next door. You have China, and you have the Cambodia and the killing fields and the Khmer Rouge in the 70s and 80s. And then you've got the Americans trying to counter that. And so they fuel these hill tribes that can resist the central government, and they try to sway the central government. And meanwhile, nature is being nature, and it's trying to survive while there's war going on. And while war is going on, some of these people never even, made it to the modern era. They're just still subsistence farming, even to this day. And that has saved the organisms there. There was a massive expedition and opening of the region to the world in 2006, and that's when the celestial pearl Daniel and the other fish I listed all became known. Literally hundreds of fish were discovered to science, and then it got closed off again. It became dangerous. The government started to crack down again, and now it opens back up in the year 2017 or 2018, and we start seeing more species again, and they're discovering them at a crazy clip. And then all of a sudden, right after COVID starts, everything goes back and the military clamps down, and the actual Shan region we're talking about is strong enough because of that gold, because of the rubies, because of the illegal arms and the counterfeit consumer goods and the money that they're making there and the crops they're growing. They can survive, and they've broken away. They have their own army. Another state known as the WA state has their own army, and there are over a dozen militaries within the country fighting the central military now, and they control basically half the country, with China having factions and backing people, the US having interests, Russia having interests in the past during the Cold War. There's lots of leftover munitions and things, and now they have the biggest trade of rubies, and yes, they've discovered all new amounts of gold. And when you mine gold, you need water, and you dig, and they are just clearing the entire mountaintop oftentimes and using water from beautiful, pristine, remote rivers where only, rural farmers had lived before. And these fish are dying before they're being discovered. So I want to encourage you, check out this fish. Learn about this fish if you haven't had them already. They're fascinating. They're adorable. They're beautiful. Get at least 8 of them. Watch them socialize. If you want to breed them, I'd have at least a dozen. There's no limit upper-wise to what you need. They get about an inch long. You probably want a 20-gallon or up tank for them, ideally, just so they can swim around a full amount. And have lots of plants and biofilm in there, so there's some microflora and fauna. And then watch these fish. Put them in a community tank. They do great with other little microfish, and they're slightly boisterous, dare I say, slightly aggressive tendencies will only be amongst themselves, the males amongst themselves. And it's not biting. They don't have teeth in their mouth to nip at fins or anything. So they're not going to harm other fish, but they may eat baby shrimp. So I wouldn't call them shrimp compatible. But you can keep adult neocaridina or caridina shrimp with them. You can keep a mono shrimp with them. Bigger shrimp are no problem. But keep them, and they will be a living, breathing little symbol of overcoming adversity, of overcoming pollution, greed, the mineral mining, the war, all these things, and the hope that there's still new things yet to be discovered. The preservation and the conservation that has gone into keeping these places safe now that these actual ethnic groups are trying to take over and take responsibility for themselves with the help of international groups now too. And the actual interconnectedness and all the plants and all the other fish and evolutionarily fascinating stories that overlap and interweave with the ROSY Loach or the Physoschustra mango loach. The mango loach, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for being here. Without you, this channel isn't possible. And I will see you on the next episode of FISHTORY. Thank you so much.